Thank you, first of all, very much for being here. You may know from previous communications that our guests had to reschedule from last week. They were called to high-level meetings, and they'll tell us a little bit about that. They have also had to reschedule their own travel plans for today multiple times, given the weather, and they've made great efforts to sort of stick it out and be here with us. So thank you very much for all of that. So I wonder if you could start for us by simply laying out for the audience the sort of social fabric of Syria and explain who major religious and ethnic groups in Syria are and what their place in the current conflict is.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, it's an honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here again for the second year. I came here last year, and this is the first time for Bassel. I think once you get a taste for this like eloquent audience and their amazing and smart questions, he will want to come like every year. So again, thank you very much for having us here. So just to talk in general, like about the social fabric in Syria, as dominantly, I would say, like to talk about the broader religion is Muslim with minority Christianity. Inside the Muslim, there is a wide range of sects. There's like, if you count the Kurds, they count about like 75% of the population, they are Sunnis or labeled Sunnis because we have like so many seculars. Without the Kurds, because the Kurds by nature, usually they're not religious or they're very, I would say, moderate. So you're talking about 65%. We have Alawites, we have Shia, which is a lot of times Alawites are usually classified as offshoot of Shia. It really like depends on the president. In the father's era, Hafez al-Assad era, they were like try to be merged under the Sunni, I would say, like ruling, or the Sunni usually like education. And then like when Bashar al-Assad, the son, the current dictator, became like a puppet for Iran, they're like now is becoming like more of closer to the Shia, but it's kind of like a sect by itself. We have Ismaili, we have Yazidi, and we have actually different even ethnics, because we have Syrian, and we have the Kurds, we have the Arabs inside Syria. So usually, and just I would like usually to start by highlighting, other than the social fabrics, that if you take the minorities that usually they're not conservative by nature, adding the Kurds to them, you're accounting to 35% immediately in Syria. They're usually opposed to any kind of, in the broader term, any kind of conservative kind of rulings. If you also account to that major cities, that's usually the secularism in Syria started from major cities and from like the Sunni population, then you're a pretty good odd that you have like over the 60+% usually like support a secular state, or usually would like to use like the word civil state without going into too much details, because it's in the Arab world. Secular right now, it has a little bit negative connotation as anti-religion, and civil, it kind of like, it means we agree on the same thing, but it's usually like it's secularism without like alienating religion in the society and all of that.
So 4 years ago, when the resistance began, it was the aim of the groups who were protesting was a free, democratic, pluralistic Syria. Can you talk to us about your assessment at this moment about whether that dream is still alive, whether that vision is still a possibility, and on what you base your predictions about the future?
And let me first say, Oubab is right. I would love to come every year. The energy and the level of discourse here has been fantastic for us all day, and it's a pleasure to speak with you. I wish you were speaking and I was listening, but I think we'll get to that part. You're right. The simplest way I have to explain it is that in times of conflict or in times of war, the voices of freedom, democracy, peacemaking tend to be muffled by the very loud sounds of conflict. And I think that's exactly what's happening in Syria. It did start as a peaceful protest movement. People were demanding, in fact, not even that the government changed. They were demanding reforms at the beginning. After the government's reaction, it did induce many people to increase the level of their demands to the point where, like you said, they eventually resulted in some armed resistance. Now, the way it happened was a little bit disjointed. There was no central management of the militarization of the conflict, for example, on the opposition side. Hence, the couple of years that followed where it was very disjointed, again, contributing to the drowning out of the sounds of peace and moderation. Now, those voices are still there. I'll take it as an example. About 1 year ago, in fact, I think 1 year ago this month, we had the Geneva peace negotiations in Geneva that were supposed to be based on a communique from 2012, commonly referred to as the Geneva Communique, that laid out a sort of negotiation process for the Syrian parties to get together and decide how to transition from the dictatorship to a democracy. The Syrian government accepted to attend, the Syrian opposition accepted to attend. At that conference, the Syrian opposition presented a roadmap for peace that actually, or for transition and peace, that actually, as we see it, embodied exactly those principles. What it did was it laid out a set of steps and a set of principles. Many of them are things that you'd think were the basic source of the revolution, the need for democracy, the needs for freedom, for dignity, pluralistic governance, elected governance, people having the ability to elect their representatives in government and then change them at the ballot box if they weren't happy. I mean, these are things we take for granted at a very basic level here that just don't exist over there. So these were the things we'd wanted to talk about at Geneva. The government at that time was not interested in having that kind of conversation. The reasons for that, I think there were differences on the international support that both sides were getting. There were some perceived advantages on the ground. I mean, I can't explain why they did it, but the point is they didn't negotiate. We did 2 rounds of that negotiation. As the UN envoy said when he resigned later, that it was this government's obstinance to stick to its guns and refuse to negotiate with the opposition that has resulted in now the rise of some of these extremist groups. So I think when those moderate groups are not in an environment where their principles and their aspirations are being voiced, they're going to lose out to extremists. It's going to be almost a natural growth of this kind of extremist ideology. And the extremists, by the way, their threat is first and foremost on exactly the moderate opposition. The moderate opposition was the first to bear the brunt of the extremist growth in Syria. It continues to be that way today. At the beginning, it was Free Syrian Army brigades and other revolutionary brigades that were fighting against ISIS far before the U.S.-led coalition began its airstrikes, and it continues to be that way on the ground today. How do we know is a very good question. Now, we have to take our cue from what the Syrian people want. And I want to just say, in pure statistics, there are probably a few hundred, maybe up to 500,000 Syrians who actually bear arms, who are actually fighting in Syria right now. But there are 22 million other Syrians. The humanitarian crisis is the worst it's been. Over half the population is displaced, many of them internally displaced, 3 million of them refugees in other countries. The need for humanitarian assistance is now at 11 to 12 million, and by the end of 2015, it's estimated to be at 18 million people out of 22 million that need humanitarian assistance to survive. So it's very, very serious. It's very, very grave, and it's those people, the 22 million, whose voices need to be elevated by a political debate, by a transition negotiation. You need the consent of the armed groups, of course, because in the end, that'll be the source of, or at least the core of them, that'll be the source of the beginning of a peacemaking process. But when we talk about what principles we want exemplified in a transitional government, in a constitution, in a new system, it's those voices. And I know Oubab and we make an effort to as does almost everyone in the opposition, to talk to people who are experiencing this on the ground. ask them what they want, what their hopes and visions and dreams are for Syria. No matter how aspirational and pie in the sky it may sound, those are the principles that, even if we can't achieve them today, that will guide the actions that we have to take as we engage in the many different political tracks.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think it's safe to say that for a great majority of Americans who either pay attention or have passing acquaintance with what's unfolding in Syria, what's most visible to them is the Islamic State and ISIS. For better or worse, this is how the conflict is often represented to them. Can you, from the point of view of the place where you stand, can you discuss the origins of the Islamic State and how it came to occupy the position of prominence that it does now?
Yeah, I'll let Oubab talk about that. I just recall one quip I heard to exemplify this phenomenon you're talking about in the media. Somebody said, have you ever heard of Syria? And the other person said, no, where is it? And he said, it's that area just south of Kobani, when the strikes were happening there.
So speaking of Daesh or ISIS or the Islamic State, we don't like to prefer it as Islamic State because it's neither Islamic nor a state. The origin started actually in Iraq. So the expansion, this huge expansion, it just happened recently. It came, I would say, from the right-wing camp of Al-Qaeda. It was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is like the leader of the Daesh. He was on the team of al-Zarqawi. And al-Zarqawi was known for his brutality and just like kind of he was in a different camp than the Zawahiri. So even in Al-Qaeda, we see like different camps and different competing priorities. The priority for the Islamic State from the time that was in Iraq was to establish a foothold and to use the chaos or the failed state in the making. And their strategy, and I will come to that, in Iraq was completely different than Syria. In Iraq, they were building on the extreme kind of alienation of the Sunni population by the Shia-dominant government, by the government of al-Maliki. Where in Syria, when it came to Syria, it started like immediately by force. The first thing they did in the first city that they came to in Raqqa was to get rid of all the civilian activists, destroy their computers, prevent them from internet, get them to Sharia court, and just like follow them and make sure they're either killed, jailed, or just like run away. They run them off. So that's the first action. So when it started like in 2003 or 2004, and I would say the Assad regime was at the very least a collaborator in all that movement. There was in Syria a known jihadi training camps, and the purpose of that was to kill the Americans in Iraq, to make sure that the mission in Iraq fails and they do not come to Syria, because at that time President Bush was talking about possibility about invading Syria or just coming after the Assad regime. So that was like the whole purpose for supporting. They had jailed from the 80s like Islamists, and they had people in jail there. They released a lot of these people. They trained them, they fostered the jihadi ideas, and they will facilitate their like path to Iraq, and they support them. And there was a lot of negotiation that's very known on the record now between like US generals and the Assad regime about like the jihadi groups. These efforts, it came like into play with the Syrian revolution. They started from the early days. Within the first few months, the Assad regime, he released like a lot of these people from prison, because after a while they jailed some of them to kind of when the relation was, I would say, warming up a little bit with the US after like the Iraq invasion. And collaborated with him, al-Maliki. There was like the famous incident. They let about 1,000 people who are known Al-Qaeda associate or leader or affiliate from Abu Ghraib prison, and they let them on the loose. And they said they just like broke away and they run off. So that's we're saying they are collaborating. And if you look at what's going on in the Islamic State actions, there is a very intended trying to avoid any confrontation between the regime, between the Islamic states. If you see the regime does not like, whenever they use barrel bombs or whenever they use airplanes, they try to use it in heavily, densely populated areas. They avoid any locations that has any of the violent extremists in Syria. So that's in a nutshell how it started and how it came. So the main difference is like in Syria, they came from day one using extreme force, and that's how they still continue to be in every city and wherever like they can get their hands on. In Iraq was a little bit different.
Thanks. We heard previously former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton say essentially that it was the U.S. failure to help Syrian rebels that led to the rise of the Islamic State. From where you sit, do you think that's an accurate assessment?
There was a big problem, like I said, with the lack of management of the militarization of the opposition. I think there was an opportunity early on, I would say, even throughout 2012, maybe even in 2013, where you could have come in as an external force, whether it's a UN force or some kind of peacekeeping mission to try and at least separate the parties. And former special envoy from the UN, Brahimi, has mentioned something similar like this recently. You could have at least separated the parties and jump-started a negotiation process. The alternative for the backers of the moderate opposition was to, if it was going to become violent and it was going to become armed anyway, that it be done in a way that was managed, that was made to ensure that, to the extent possible, that was being done by nationalist fighters who were fighting for the interests of Syria, for the protection of Syrians, and not to become extremists or people who would turn against the West or people who would turn against the moderates. At some point, we looked at it as almost three pretty distinct buckets. I mean, it's a very messy situation, but we looked at it like three buckets. There was the regime bucket, which was being filled by Iran and Russia. Ammunition, sophisticated arms, training, on-the-ground support, Hezbollah support. Then there was the bucket of the extremists. And that was being financed by their existing terror financing networks, and even after a while, some of their own self-generating revenue from oil fields and black market sales and things like that. Then there was this third bucket, and that third bucket was the moderates. And the third bucket, there was no coordinated attempt to fill it in a way that it could stand as a plausible alternative to the other two buckets. So I think there is some truth in that. And what happened after a while was that bucket became so squeezed that now you could say still the moderate nationalist opposition is the least supported group on the ground in Syria, all things considered, unfortunately.
I would start by saying I think this statement is very accurate. We had a very good window of opportunities because I would say most of the Free Syrian Army, when it first started, it was a mix. The large of it was Syrian army officer defector who refused to carry order to kill civilians, and they deserted to their villages and homes to protect their families, their mothers and sisters and brothers and children. So that was the base of it. So they were trained. They just needed the right amount of support and the right amount of pressure. And from day one, even the defected officers, they had a very clear message. We need the support to be able to pressure the regime to start a political process, to start the negotiation, to at least, we don't want to attack, we want to just make sure we're not being attacked. We're not being attacked by chemical weapons or by warplanes, and we want to just apply the pressure, be able to defend ourselves, apply the pressure so we can push the regime, change its calculus and push it to the negotiation table. And that did not happen. The support was due to various reasons. We can bore you for hours with it, but it was very little. It wasn't organized. It wasn't systematic. It wasn't based on institutionalized way. It wasn't managed well. So it created, I think it didn't create any good outcome out of it. It wasn't to the level. So definitely the statement is accurate. Yeah,
and I want to add, by the way, this is sort of what's happening now. So the plan for the U.S. to train and equip moderate forces in Syria for limited purposes, which is beginning now here, I think we'll see in the next month or couple of months, that force being ready to take on its tasks, hopefully. As is true it's as true with this force as it would have been with a previous attempt to do this, is that the goal of this arming is not warmongering. The goal of this is not fighting. The goal of any kind of intervention or any kind of arming still should be peacemaking. I mean, in the end, when the goal is more conflict, then what we're getting is what we've got, which is basically an outbreak of warlordism. People now with fiefdoms and arms and illegal smuggling and some really nasty things that are happening in Syria, where you have people whose embedded interests are now the continuation of the conflict and the maintenance of this chaotic status quo. What you want to do is enable the people who would benefit in a time of peace. And if that is your motivation, then there is an opportunity to affect the balance on the ground, to force that kind of political process to result in some kind of stability. I mean, at this point, we're far beyond one solution getting stability in the whole country. We've been past that point for a while, but there's at least the beginning of something that can be had if it's directed in the right way and managed with the right intentions, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. So last week, we were anticipating a visit from you, and as the scheduled date approached, you got a phone call, and you were invited to sort of high-level consultation and to the White House summit on countering violent extremism. Could you talk a little bit about your experience and help us see what that summit looked like from your seat in the audience, and to what degree you think it holds promise for some progress on countering extremism?
Sure, and I say in addition to, from our perspective, in addition to some of these Syrian groups being the first to take on ISIS over a year ago, to this day, it's still the Syrian people and the Iraqi people, but in Syria, it's the Syrian people who are the first-line victims and targets for ISIS. So our concern is not only from an American national security perspective, but from the perspective of the safety of Syrian civilians, of the territorial integrity of Syria, of their property, of their livelihoods, of their persons. So it is a very deeply important thing to Syrians. They've been on the record outspoken on the political opposition side against violent extremism. Many of the armed groups on the ground have gotten behind that and shown it on the ground as well. So it's very reassuring to hear that is one of the priorities. Now, we happen to believe that in Syria, you can't, Oubab very accurately said earlier, there are very different approaches in Iraq and in Syria. In Iraq, there was sort of a political transition with Maliki leaving before the anti-ISIS operations began. In Syria, the anti-ISIS operations began before the political transition that's still being worked on, and as recently as today, the president said is still a policy goal of the United States. But we believe ultimately you need that political transition to effectively degrade and ultimately defeat or destroy ISIS in Syria. ISIS is in Syria because of the political, because of the chaos that's resulting from the lack of political stability and political transition. So for us, transitioning the government in Syria is a key part of an anti-extremist strategy overall.
So just to build on what my colleague Bassel said is the political path, any political solution in Syria will not destroy immediately ISIS and just like countering the violent extremists like overnight. It's definitely will set the path as it did in Iraq. I would say in Syria it will set it in more clear terms, and it will speed the process a lot more, I would say, and it will contribute very positively on what's going on in Iraq if we do that like in Syria. And right now with the air campaign, at least up till today, the cost and the effectiveness, it hasn't been up to the expectation of what we could achieve if we have the Syrian forces on the ground, well-trained and well-equipped, being able to fight against the counter-violent extremists, other than the very limited resources that they have right now.
Yeah, and so that was the message at the White House summit last week. At the White House summit, the goal of the president was to keep this on a continuing sort of dialogue, very specifically that later this fall there would be another summit where after a series of consultations over the next few months, the different working groups would come together with specific strategies and tactics for countering violent extremism. Some very large initiatives were in fact announced at that conference as well, which we look forward to seeing implemented. And our position is that we will stay involved and stay engaged with the State Department and the White House and other agencies on countering violent extremism. To the extent we can help, we will volunteer to be partners in that, as we have been. We will take part in strategy sessions and working groups, and hopefully take part in the next summit later this fall.
So you were speaking earlier today about your own sense of what it meant for the Syrian National Coalition to be invited, for the strong push the White House and the State Department were putting behind this effort. What was happening in the room? What was your sense of what was unfolding in that setting, and what its intentions were?
I would say that first, the energy was the U.S. has put a lot of energy and resources into this, and I think it was from our seat, like on the table over there, it was an extremely successful event, heavily attended. It was like 60+ countries in the same room. President Obama spoke in the 2 days consecutively. Secretary John Kerry spoke. National Security Advisor Susan Rice, Attorney General Eric Holder, and a couple of Assistant Secretary were like at the event. And as Bassel said, they said this meeting, the purpose of that meeting was to start a process of international efforts to counter violent extremists wherever they are, not only in Iraq and Syria, but to counter the whole ideology. And kind of the homework, the takeaway is to prepare for an action plan, concrete steps that can be taken to the United Nations General Assembly in September this year and be presented to be a part of an international efforts to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS, like at bay or wherever it exists, and the violent extremists. Until then, there are going to be a series of conferences and meetings. One great initiative it immediately started. There is a hub that has been created in partnership between the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and the United States. It's based now and open for business in Abu Dhabi. And the whole purpose is to counter the violent extremists from communication, Twitter standpoint. So that's already like one of the projects that has been announced. And there's a lot of other initiatives. So many countries express supports in taking like immediately steps in small conferences to try to work on tangible steps. European countries, there was focus about the integration process to prevent more foreign fighters, because the foreign fighters issue in Europe is more of an immediate danger, and the numbers that joining ISIS from Europe is a lot higher. From the US, I think the estimated official numbers about like 100 Americans that have joined ISIS. From Europe, from France alone, between France and UK, there is like about 1,500 at least, and combined with other countries, there are like few thousand. So there was a lot of focus about the need for integration and economic development, especially into the minority groups and that are in these countries.
Yeah, so can you help us understand this a little bit? We're hearing almost day by day now news stories of young people in Europe, in Canada, and elsewhere who are stopped from traveling to join ISIS and to engage the battle there. What do we know about these people? Why are they undertaking this effort? What is the attraction that's drawing people who are largely born outside the Middle East, raised in Europe or in North America? What's the attraction to joining this organization?
Well, there is no simple answer to that. We can talk into some of the examples that we're seeing and some of the reasons. It's not like inclusive all the reasons, but the integration is big one. Usually the gangster mentality, the kind of the need to belong to and hold power and be in a powerful position. When we were looking at the numbers and kind of the backgrounds, we found that it's very interesting. That was at the summit at the White House, that a lot of the people that they are joining ISIS, they're not the poor or the unfortunate ones. We're seeing more educated population joining ISIS. We're seeing more of well-to-do people joining ISIS. So it is kind of, there is a proactive recruitment campaign, and people are joining because they have either gangster mentality, or they have the need for power, or the need to belong to a family or society, and they present them with a lot of these ideas on social media. And those few of the reasons, Bassel.
So we're also hearing stories of young women now who have, through social media and others, made contacts with people in the Islamic State who are traveling to Iraq and Syria, sort of buying this fantasy about what it might mean to be in this place, in this particular world. So you've discussed this hub that is part of this new effort by the White House and others. Can you talk about the role of social media and the possibilities for engaging social media as an effective kind of counter to the attractions of the Islamic State and other organizations like it?
Yeah, sure, I can try. This is a little bit outside of my expertise, but I can tell you what we've observed. And the idea that was elaborated at the summit last week was that there have to be multiple tracks to address this growing threat. One is certainly the military track. I mean, there's a military situation on the ground. There's people in immediate risk and immediate danger. And there's the long-term danger that these groups are plotting against the U.S. and its allies and interests as well. So sometimes you have to address that militarily. There's the intelligence angle. There's the political angle. There's a communications angle. So the communication side, again, as we understand, one of these prongs is that there are a couple ways you can go out in the social media and counter this ideology, because really ultimately we want to do. One is by sort of a broad communication attempt to counter the narrative of ISIS and other extremist groups. And the other is a more targeted approach. And both of these can be done on social media. So a more targeted approach of finding people who may be at risk and extending the communications that way. And there may be a difference in your approach when you're doing it generally to just to get the narrative out versus when you're doing it at a targeted audience. And I think that's part of the mission. I can say, like Oubab said, that the display, the messaging that the White House put out on this last week was very strong, that they do intend to invest heavily in this, that they do see it as a major part of the, and General John Allen, who's the presidential envoy for the anti-ISIL coalition, has said that it's one of the main prongs of the effort to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL. And I think we see that they're taking that seriously, and I expect that that they'll continue to try and counter that. Now, there were some, including a prominent Syrian sheikh who spoke from the Muslim side at the summit as well, and said that another part of this is getting the message out that, like Oubab said earlier, Islamic State is not Islamic. This is an interpretation of Islam that is counter to the religion of Islam. So this is another sort of part of the social media messaging that they intend to pursue, I think.
To just build on, it's Imam Sheikh Al-Yaqoubi. He's an eloquent English speaker. If you want to Google him or look him up, he has few YouTube videos, and he speaks extensively about countering violent extremists. At the White House summit, he had very interesting ideas, and they're very simple, and I would say they very doable. One of the things is to have an encyclopedia that when people Google basic questions, can you burn people alive? What's the answer to that? Can you cut people's heads? Can you just things that might seem awful to any ordinary person, just you have the answers from Islamic scholars, from religious figures to this basic questions, and have an encyclopedia on the net. Another program that he has suggested, and it got a lot of attention, is teach the teacher, teach like kind of the preacher, the people who are like, makes them be capable and able to counter any like arguments that the violent extremists putting forward, to counter their narrative at the very, very narrow level, at the mosque in their cities, at their neighborhoods, at bigger scale, just to be able to answer any questions and talk to these young people. A third efforts, and that wasn't the imam, to move outside from some other ideas. I want to touch on one idea on the communication, which is it has been found very effective, and there is a great effort from the US and other countries to try first to target the first pool of recruitment for a lot of the violent extremists is usually the relatives and narrow circle of friends. And that's the first circle that should be communicated with and should be the target of any communication efforts. And I'm sure it will be the target of the hub center, that partnership between UAE and the United States. The other one is there is a lot of focus on training the mothers, the women, and the parents in general, because they are capable, they are the first people who could witness any signs of like their children or their kids, if they have any tendencies or they have like any efforts to join any of these groups. So these things could be prevented at bay, and we're seeing some of the results by preventing people and by getting to people before they even get like on an airplane.
So you referenced it a minute ago, and I referenced it in my remarks. I want to ask you directly about the president's press conference the other day following the summit. So for all the important things that might have happened during that summit, the sort of headline-grabbing remark by the president was his refusal to discuss Islamic terrorism, to use that phrase, that concept. We spoke in class a little bit this morning about the degree to which you see this in Syria as a religious conflict or a conflict that might intersect with religion in any way. Could you speak to the President Obama's remarks the other day and whether you think it's accurate to describe what has happened in Syria in the last 4 years as a religious conflict?
I would say first, I'm not Muslim, so I don't want to characterize what I can't characterize, but I don't see what I've seen in the revolution, in my participation with opposition groups and revolutionary groups. I don't see the motivation of the revolution as a religious one, and that's been the case for me since the beginning. Now, the nature of the conflict in many cases may have taken a religious tone. I think what I always thought, one of the things that made Syria such a strong country and such a strong people was its diversity of its religion, its ethnic diversity that Oubab gave an overview of earlier. It's also going to be one of the things that makes it incredibly difficult to resolve the conflict. I think there are ways to address these kinds of fault lines in a conflict. I think some people are working very hard at coming up with ways to do that based on previous successful and unsuccessful models, where their lessons can be learned. But now, sometimes I think we'd have to differentiate between the revolution and the conflict. And that's why I say I don't see a religious motivation to what the people of Syria want. The people of Syria want a civil state that's free, that's democratic, like I said, where they can hold government officials accountable through the ballot box, where there are freedoms and equality, an accessible court system. Those aren't religious things. Those are things that people want for their day-to-day lives. And again, like I said, the conflict certainly has taken in many cases, in many places, a religious tone. Now, when you're talking about something like ISIS or Nusra or some of the other religious extremist groups, then of course it doesn't matter how we characterize them. They've characterized themselves that way. But there are other groups that are not religious that are still extremists. There are many groups that are religious that are not extremist or violent.
Let me start by a great quote from Imam Yaqoubi, and it was also like at the White House summit. President Obama, one of the things that he spoke, he said, the West is not at war with Islam. So Imam Yaqoubi said, the West is not at war with Islam, and Islam is not at war with the West. There's like over 1 billion Muslim all over the world. If you look even at the people that joining actually ISIS, they're like people who convert to Islam, probably know nothing about Islam for a couple of months, then joining ISIS. If you look full countries of Muslim countries, there is not a single person in al-Nusra, and at least no one can identify because they have the numbers of the nationalities. For example, Oman as a country, there is no one in any violent extremist groups. Indonesia, large population of India. The second thing in Syria, specifically in Syria and less so in Iraq and other countries, the first line, the most victims are being killed are the Sunni population. That the violent extremists, they are like claiming that they represent, or they are claiming that they are Islamic, or they are like the Sunni. But if you look by the numbers, by the amount of incidents, by the car bombs, by the beheading, by the burning people alive, by all of that, the Sunni are the main victim and they're paying the highest price. The number of terrorist attacks in the Arab world from the violent extremists and the number of victims outnumber the victims from all the other incidents combined in 1 year. And if you see at the number, the trade of the number, or like kind of, if you follow the history of it, it's increasing. It's not like decreasing. So Sunni population, Muslims are the victims of the first victims of the violent extremists. And we have the vital interest in like being the first line. We're always saying, even in Iraq, the best way to be able to counter the violent extremists when Iraq was able to stabilize even these areas was with the help of the Sunnis. So the Sunnis are the first line, the first people who are willing to hold the guns, to fight these people, to pay their lives, to defend their family and villages, because we're the one who are being killed in our homes.
Thank you, thank you. In a moment, I'd like to give students and others in the audience a chance to ask questions. So I might ask if the mic stand that was in the room could be brought back up here, and I'll put this handheld mic in there. But I haven't given you a chance to talk yet directly about your organization, about the Syrian National Coalition. Could you just say a word? Could you characterize it for yourself, for us, as you would? Who is this organization? Why do you represent them, and why do you think that that we all ought to know about them and be following them?
Sure. Without getting into too much nitty-gritty, basically it represents the political arm of the moderate opposition that's seeking a transition in Syria from a dictatorship to an open democratic society. Now, there's a lot of room for play within that basic framework that I just laid out, and I think it's fair to say that there's a spectrum of interest represented in the coalition that would interpret that on one end in a certain way, and on the other end in a totally different way. You know, in the same way that you can think of the coalition as a legislative body for the revolution. In the same way that you have a spectrum of parties represented in a legislative body, you have a spectrum represented in the Syrian coalition. Now that spectrum looks a little different than a Western parliament, for example, just because of the cultural context, the fact that they've gone 40 years without any kind of political participatory democracy. So it looks different. It's not, I mean, it's hard to characterize the entire organization one way, or to say I represent the entire organization one way, which by the way I don't. I'm not a spokesperson or representative or even a member of the coalition. I'm their legal advisor. I would say that generally that's what. Now, why do we work with them? There has to be hope in a political process that can bring an end to some of the violence, or all of the violence in the long term, by providing humanitarian assistance in the short term, by providing political support, and by providing support to the negotiation process. Now, there's a variety of negotiation processes that are happening at a given time. The Geneva process is one. The Cairo process, which Oubab attended recently, is another that started, or that's actually continued recently. There's a UN process that's focusing on Aleppo. We provide support because we believe that there is a political solution to the conflict. We believe there is a mechanism in the coalition that can play a productive role in the resolution of the conflict and in the increasing of the rights and freedoms of the Syrians and the decreasing of the burdens and difficulties on the Syrians. So that's essentially why. Now, the coalition was formed about a year or two into the revolution, around November of 2012, as this kind of legislative body for the opposition, the moderate opposition. It was given the support of the 120 or so countries, including the United States, at the helm, and recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people. After that time, the coalition opened foreign offices in major capitals. In Washington and New York, we opened the foreign offices that later became recognized under U.S. federal law as foreign missions. And the whole reason and the whole purpose of this is that political process, the fact that you believe you can do something to provide humanitarian relief for the millions of Syrians who need it, and do something to help that political process that might eventually bring even greater relief to people and change.
I would just like say one quick sentence about that. We believe as the Syrian Coalition, it's kind of the umbrella organization that looks to achieve the aspiration of the Syrian people that they're looking for a plural, civil, democratic state, stabilized state with economic prosperity, a country, a Syria, a future Syria that will have a great relation with the US, with France, with UK, with the international community, not have the best relation with Russia and Iran, which is what the Assad regime currently have. That's the two countries that main backers. One of the things that we would like to emphasize all the time is the Geneva Communique of June 30th, 2012 that we believe in. It says that any transitional governing body, it has to be done by mutual consent. This is usually, and there is actually, this is like by itself, it kind of guarantee that continuity of the state institution and continuity of the jobs for the people and start the process for reform, which is something we're extremely careful about to not have a complete collapse like what happened with the Iraq example. So we don't have like chaos more than what we already have. Another thing we have in the bylaws of our organization that our organization will dissolve itself upon forming a transitional governing body. And for the first 2 years, member of our organization cannot hold any position in the transitional governing body. So we are working to achieve a transition. We're not doing a power struggle about who's going to be in office. We're trying to achieve a transition toward democratic, pluralistic civil state.
So I'm very mindful of our own guests' need to get on the road literally and get themselves back home to D.C. And our own need to get home safely and so forth. But I want to take one last opportunity to express the gratitude of Elon University. We're very fortunate to have forged this relationship, and people have raised the hope of a visit in the future. And should we be fortunate enough to have you again, you know, it's our sincere hope we'll have a materially different kind of situation to talk about. So thank you very much.